Welcome to New Rechts, or for English listeners, New Right. My name is Daniel de Liever, and today we're going to talk about the impact of smartphones and you could say technology in general for children and childhood. And I'm happy to discuss this topic with Jennifer Powers. Thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
For those that don't know you, you founded Unplugged Coalition. We're going to talk about what you do, but maybe we can start with you giving a short introduction in your background so people that are listening also know who I'm talking to today.
Well, yes. Thank you for inviting me on, Daniel. It's great to be here. I have a background in public policy and politics. Here in the UK, I'm a dual American-British citizen, but I've spent most of my life now in the UK. And I guess the height of my career, if one can call it that, was I worked in number 10 Downing Street in the policy unit for then Prime Minister Boris Johnson after business, energy and regulation policy. And after leaving Downing Street, went back to self-employment, went back to policy consultancy, and then the smartphone-free childhood movement really kicked off here in the UK. And over the last 13 months, my life has been pretty much taken over by this movement to create smartphone-free childhoods.
It's an interesting topic. I do hear also in the Netherlands quite a lot about it. But let's just start with the obvious question. Why would anybody care about a childless, smartphone-less childhood?
Well, the evidence is increasingly clear of the negative impacts of smartphone use and social media use on children. And this really spans many, many factors. But we have the harmful, violent, pornographic content, encouragement to self-harm, sexual exploitation, and we have the impact on mental health and well-being of children. So we see a huge uptick in depression and anxiety, especially amongst girls, since smartphones have been ubiquitous amongst children. And this really happened right around 2011. For any of your viewers or listeners who have heard of Professor Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, which is now quite a seminal text amongst parents worldwide, they'll be familiar with some of these statistics, which is a child that really loves their smartphone or social media, they have a nearly 40% chance of becoming clinically depressed. So they're I think it's twice as likely to be anxious, 3 times as likely to be depressed than a child who doesn't use their smartphone heavily. So these are really stark statistics, and putting poor mental health and horrific content to one side, there's also just the opportunity cost of children spending so much time staring at their screen. It's time they're not doing other things, whether that's studying, doing their homework, being with their friends in person, being active, being outdoors. So really, childhood has fundamentally changed, at least here in the UK. I'd be interested to hear what it's like in the Netherlands and elsewhere. But childhood here has fundamentally changed over the last 15 years. And that's had a really negative impact on British children.
I think, sadly, what you're describing is pretty much the same in the Netherlands. I think in the Netherlands, in many ways, is quite similar to the English-speaking world. Culturally, it always looks to the Anglo-Saxon world. But I think even in other countries like France and Germany, you see this happening quite a lot. Sadly, I would say. Let's unpack, because there's a lot of things you said there that are interesting to talk about. On one hand, you said, there's problematic content, exploitative content even sometimes. So then what I see happening a lot and hearing a lot also from the policy community is that people are like, okay, so we need to make sure that people under a certain age don't see this kind of content. Why don't we just regulate this content instead of saying no smartphones for children? What do you think about this principle that we're seeing?
Yeah, that is really a live debate, Daniel. I agree. And I'm glad you raised it, because it's something that I really take issue with, because we've been been talking about cleaning up the internet probably since the internet was around. And yes, there can be less horrific content on the internet. Of course, the tech platforms can do more to remove that content and to not target it at our children. But it's never going to become 100% safe. It's just not possible. And so for me, it's a little bit beside the point in the sense that I really want to go upstream. I believe in looking at the cause rather than the downstream impact, right? So how are these children getting online? How are they getting to this world of digital content in the first place? And that's through devices. And at least here in the UK, parents weren't really engaged in this debate. It was in the policy world. It was in political circles. We had something here called the Online Safety Act, which is supposed to bring these tech companies to account and encourage and mandate them to remove harmful content. But parents, by and large, just were, as we know from the statistics, they were giving their children smartphones. They were allowing their children on social media. And this was almost an academic debate. But once we changed that debate from one around the arbitrary, sort of amorphous, what's happening in this abstract digital world, and we started talking about something physical, we started talking about the smartphone. I think as parents, as people, as humans, we're much more able to grasp, okay, this is a device which is a gateway to very damaging content, but also to addictive behaviors. And I think it allowed parents and children and really all of us to get a much firmer grasp and actually, as I said, go upstream to what was the cause. And, if you take the device away or you delay giving your child that smartphone until they're a bit older, then you really take away the vast opportunities for them to access this content. Now, that's not to say they can't access it via a laptop or a tablet, but in reality, that is much more difficult for children to do because they're simply not as portable. If your child is on a laptop, they're probably in school where they're being supervised or semi-supervised, or hopefully they're at home. The point of a smartphone is that it's can go in their pocket and they can look at it under their, covers in bed. They can look at it as they're walking in the street or in the playground. And so they're really able to become addicted to the content and really use up so much of their life watching that content. So for me, that's really been the big sea change here in Britain. And I think a lot of people are now conceptualizing a smartphone as actually a product for adults and not a product for children. Because really, why do children need 24/7 access to email or, yes, we want to stay in touch. I think children here in Britain perhaps have fewer freedoms than they do in the Netherlands. So children do like to track their child. They want to be able to see where their child is when they're out and about, and they want to be able to communicate with them. But all of that can be done, via a phone that is not a full all singing, all dancing smartphone. And so I think we're really seeing a questioning of what here in the UK is almost total saturation of children with smartphones. There's some really scary statistics that I'll just share with you, which is the average age for getting a smartphone in this country is 9.
That's very young. That's for sure very young.
It's very young. And by 12, 94% of children in Britain have a smartphone, right? Now, obviously, I and others that are active in the smartphone free childhood movement are working really hard to bring those numbers down. But we're starting from a base where smartphones are everywhere. And just really working hard to try to reset social norms.
I do think there, again, a lot of to unpack there. That's interesting. I would say that on the safety issue, I would say to play devil's advocate, that nothing in life is 100% safe, right? If you go into a car, it's also not 100% safe, just to give the devil his due, to be honest. But I think the problem with the regulation is that you're going to have mass surveillance of who is a certain age and who not. So it's actually very anti-privacy, what we're seeing now in other countries such as Australia. So I do think there's not a big solution for it. So I agree with you that smartphone in itself therefore becomes a problem. I'm curious to hear from you. What would be the ideal age then, if for children or for people to get a smartphone? Because you're saying it should be something for adults. Does it mean 18 years old? Does it mean? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, that's a live debate, Daniel, and I don't feel that I'm the person to prescribe what that age is. I mean, I think ultimately parents have to take that choice, but they need to take that decision based on having the information and the awareness that we increasingly have about the negative impacts on children. I think increasingly with these studies that are coming out, we will see chief medical officers and the politicians coming out. For instance, we've already seen it a bit in the US with the Surgeon General. Here in Britain, we call it the chief medical officer, coming out with advice to not give screens to babies and toddlers, for instance, or to think very carefully about when you give your child access to a smartphone. So I don't know the exact date. There's one very interesting study, and forgive me for not remembering where it's from, but I think it was from 2023. And it actually showed that the later your child first gets a smartphone, the better mental health outcomes as an adult at 18. And this held true all the way through to 17, 18, which I was really surprised by, because I thought that, of course, if a child got a smartphone at 5 or 6 or 10, that would have a big impact. But would there really be a benefit to waiting once they got to be 14, 15, 16? And according to this study, there was a demonstrable impact still. Now, practically speaking, I don't know how many parents are going to wait beyond 14, 15, 16. But the evidence was showing that there was a big benefit to the health and well-being of those children as adults for every year or 6 months that they delayed receiving a smartphone. So it was really powerful data, and certainly surprised me.
It's a good point. And as someone who actually is a psychologist by background, it is not surprising to me. Because if you think about it, right, all the social media, it's not trying to stimulate your well-being to the maximum. It's trying to keep you engaged, as they say, right, as much as you can. And the way to do that is through novelty, right? The more novelty you give, the more shocking things you give, the longer people are going to stay on. It's the same way it works, of course, for us as adults. And when you're very vulnerable to this at a younger age and your brain is still developing till actually the age of 25 or so, on average, of course, it's going to have a huge impact. So that this isn't surprising, but it's good. It's a good point that you're making. I'm curious what you think, because in this whole debate, another point that you hear is, if you wait too long, then these children will not be able to understand the digital world, because, we're living more and more in digital age, and with AI and other technological advancements, people are thinking maybe it will be even more important in the future. So what would you say to people that think, I get the point, but I still believe that my children need to get some digital knowledge on how to use these devices, so as an adult in their working life, for example, they're able to do it?
Yeah, I love taking on this pushback. Because, smartphones have only been around, at least in Britain, amongst under 16s since around 2010, 2011. And I think this idea that they're necessary for children to become digitally literate is a bit of a nonsense. And I think it's pushed by the tech companies because, of course, they make money based on numbers. They want eyeballs on the internet. They want eyeballs on their platforms. And so if they lose children, they're losing, so the statistics say, 1/3 of all those eyeballs looking at their products. So it's a really good fiction for them to promote that says oh, your child will be left behind. It's like scaring parents who want to do the best by their kids. But I mean, if we break that down, how long does it take a child to learn how to use an app? I mean, it normally takes even a very tiny child a minute or two to understand how to scroll and how to tap. We've all seen very young children do that. When my child gets a new video game, it doesn't take him very long to figure out, how to click and how to go through it. I think this idea that children need to be saturated in these social media platforms or these apps from a young age so that they'll be able to learn the new apps, because whatever they're doing now won't be around and won't be popular in 5 or 10 or 20 years anyway. The idea that they have these deep skills that they need to learn now. I mean, what they're doing, they're not learning deep skills. They're spending 5 hours watching TikTok videos, right? They're not learning any skills. They're on Snap. They're getting they're chatting with their friends and sending emojis and really inane, stupid jokes, right? So I'm not against, I don't think anyone's against children learning how to use the internet as a tool, to use the internet to research, to find out information. I say, look, it's great if your child is going to research volcanoes or giraffes for their school homework, right? But that's not what we're talking about. That's best done on a laptop or a computer or a tablet. That's probably done at home or at school or an after school club or something, right? Where there's an adult around. The idea that children need to spend, I mean, in the UK, the average 12-year-old spends 3 hours and 48 minutes a day on screens outside of school. The idea that they're doing that to learn coding or that they're doing that to have meaningful tech literacy, I think is an absolute nonsense. I think they're doing it for entertainment purposes, and they're doing it because they're addicted to the content. Because as you say, this content gives you more and more of a dopamine hit, and you're hooked, and it's habit forming, and you want to keep doing it. And so yeah, I think it's a common question I get. It's a common pushback, but I think right is on our side, because this idea that children need 24/7 unsupervised access to the internet and to social media in order to be tech proficient adults, I just don't buy it.
It's a good point. Let me then give you another pushback that I hear often, because as a young parent is something I also hear a lot about. Then the next point that I often hear is, if I don't give a smartphone to my child, then all the other children have a smartphone and they're going to communicate with each other. Then socially, my child is going to be isolated because they're all going to have their own world together. They're going to discuss over social media when they're going to meet up. So it's going to have huge implication, and my child is left out. So how would you respond to this kind of way of thinking?
This is such a big issue. And it's really why the smartphone-free childhood grassroots movement started back in February of 2024. Two mums started a WhatsApp group to support each other because they felt so isolated in not wanting to give their then 9-year-old children a smartphone, and they felt like they were the only ones. One of them posted about it on Instagram, and it just went viral. And more people, including myself, joined that WhatsApp group. And within a couple of days, there were 10,000 members from across the country. And now, a year and a bit later, there are hundreds of thousands of parents on WhatsApp groups all across the UK. And it's actually spawned, I think, similar movements in 30 countries around the world. And some countries already had their own movements. There's the Heads Up Alliance in Australia. There's the Wait Till 8th campaign in the US. And indeed, there might already have been some brilliant organizations and campaigns in the Netherlands. But for whatever reason, this really sparked a conversation here in Britain and led to this absolute wildfire of interest in this. And what we're really trying to do here in Britain is grow the movement so parents aren't alone. Because what you talk about, it's a classic collective action problem. I do it because everyone else does it, and everyone else does it because everyone else does it, and then all children suffer, right? And if we look at the statistics, we know that teenagers and recent teenagers, 20-somethings, overwhelmingly say that they wish they had grown up without a diet of smartphones and social media. But they don't want to have been the only ones. They wish nobody had access. So what we have to do is we have to create this critical mass where the default switches to, instead of, well, I have to give one because everyone does or my kid will be left out, to actually most people don't. And I don't want my kid to be the odd one out in having a smartphone. And anecdotally, this is already starting to happen. I'm a regional leader here in London and in Surrey, and I moderate dozens of WhatsApp groups, which is ironic, right? Because it's a form of social media, but I am over 16, so this is allowed. But I had a parent get in touch and say that her daughter's friendship group, there were these 4 girls, and 3 of them did not have smartphones, and 1 of them did. And they had a play date at this woman's house. And I think they were 10 or 11-year-old girls. And the girl with the smartphone, when she arrived at the play date, she mentioned to her friends that she didn't bring her smartphone because she didn't want to be the odd one out and be the only one with a smartphone. Which, I mean, I just thought, oh my goodness, this is amazing.
You could say the hopeful thought is that the collective thinking, for better or for worse, this is what human beings do. So also, it means that you can also change these social movements if it will become the norm. And so that's a good point. But then the question becomes, and I think this is also a major question, let's say that we agree that we want less smartphones for children. Then the question becomes, for what you're now describing as a more bottom-up approach, where parents take their own responsibility. You also have people saying, no, the state, no matter if it's the UK government, the Dutch government, or somewhere else, needs to take more control. For example, in the Netherlands, we are seeing that at schools, for example, there's more and more pushback against having smartphones even at school. Yeah. So do you think that's more appropriate for communities, that can be schools, parents, etc., to regulate this, or should it be more of a state and government mandate?
Well, I actually think there's a role for both. And this is a discussion I've had with a lot of politicians here in Britain from a range of political parties across the spectrum. And the point I make to those politicians on the right is this isn't a classic pushback against the nanny state, pushback against state control. I actually think there's broader and deeper issues at stake here. So if we think about children and our duty as adults to safeguard and protect children, we have that responsibility first and foremost as parents, but also as a society and a community. We look after and protect our children. Now, we make rules all the time, either self-imposed or by the government, to protect kids. So we don't let them bring knives to school. We don't let them bring guns to school because we don't want them to be injured. I don't know the exact age you can drink and do drugs in the Netherlands, but we all have rules about the age appropriate, right? And we don't want them to do that at school. So this idea that, it's overreach by the state to say that there should be no smartphones in school. I say, well, come on. Isn't the role of children to be educated at school? And if children are distracted and they're not able to learn, we're depriving them and their fellow students of that opportunity to learn. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for the libertarian argument that says there's no role for the state in this. I think fundamentally, children deserve to be children. They need to grow up in the real world with all of the freedoms and the joys of being a child. And I think it's our responsibility to give them, to protect them and give them their childhoods. So it's like, put it like this, Daniel. I think it's not taking away something from the child. It's not about banning a smartphone or banning smartphones in school, although technically that could happen. For me, it's much more about giving children the freedom to be children. And the freedom to be children means that they play with their friends, that they play outside, that they're not addicted to content, and they're not seeing harmful content and being damaged and swayed by what they see online. They're able to grow up happy and healthy into, happy, healthy adults. So for me, I do think there's a role for the state. I think that it's complementary to the role for parents. But I do think, we do have to protect the most vulnerable. And often it's the most vulnerable who have parents who perhaps are not as engaged. They're not as aware. And therefore, I do think there's a role for the state in saying, much as, we rule out other harmful practices, we would protect our children from this.
It's a good argument you're putting forward. I will give a little bit of pushback, but I do agree on the last point you're making, by the way, that the uncomfortable truth is that you're seeing that in different levels of socioeconomic classes, and that is just the reality. Let's say the lower educated people are statistically more likely to give smartphones and even iPads and other things at a younger age to children when they actually need to be parented, instead of getting just access to social media as a substitute for parenting. I think that's a big underlying uncomfortable problem that is worth discussing. But to go to your main point, I agree with you that there can be a role for the state, but my problem with it personally would be, like I already said earlier in this conversation, that if you want to do that on a practical level, that means that, for example, when you give access to social media, that you need to check someone's age, which means you cannot just ask what is your age, because then everybody can just fool the system. It means that it's also for non-children, for adults, you're going to have to be changing their level of privacy when it comes to smartphones and their data, and it can all be connected. So the question is, do you want the government to have that kind of data? I think that's a very practical problem. But I think this is a real issue we're seeing now in countries that are looking to ban on the government level, for example, social media use for a specific age group.
Yeah, and I hear where you're coming from. And I used to, in a past life, work for a free speech organization. So I am at my core against censorship and for, freedom of speech and privacy. But I think this is a real fault line in this debate. And, we're still coming to grips with this digital world that is now everywhere. And I don't know. We have to weigh up the safety and well-being and health of our children and future, their future lives, versus this desire for privacy and anonymity. And I'm just not sure that it's going to come down on your side of the line, because I think that, we don't allow children to have sex, for instance. We make pedophilia illegal.
Yes.
But in a digital world, we know that if we don't age gate the internet, children will be groomed, they will be sexually exploited, or at least they will consume potentially a huge amount of hardcore violent pornography, which will damage them potentially for life. So I personally, I hear where you're coming from, but I don't see a contradiction. I would be very happy to age gate the internet at whatever age societies choose and have everything above that line, above 16 or 17 or 18, to be very much open and not censored. And because adults have agency and we can take decisions, then it's kind of on us. And then we'd have less regulation. But I do think there is a reality there that says this is so harmful, and it's impacting not just children's mental health, it's actually impacting if they can work. I mean, if you look at the worklessness rates of 20-somethings in Britain, I don't know what it's like in the Netherlands, but it's really poor. I mean, worklessness is high, and that's because of mental health issues, which is driven to a large extent by the consumption of social media on smartphones. So I think there's a reality there that says, I completely get it, that we want to create safeguard our anonymity. But I just think when we come to kids, we need to probably take the hit, and we need to find a way of keeping children off these devices and off social media and unsupervised internet until they're a bit older. But I appreciate there's lots of room for debate here.
Oh, for sure. On the goal, I think we agree. I think that having less smartphone use for children, on this we all agree. So I think it's more of a practical issue, but we'll see what happens. I do agree with you that probably governments will go towards taking this control. I do think that's in general what governments like to do, but that's a whole different issue.
Yeah.
Let's go a little bit to Unplugged Coalition. Can you tell me what you do as an organization, what your goals are, and maybe what your success has been so far?
Wow. It's very new, so I have no successes yet to report. But I talked a little bit about smartphone-free childhood and how it's a huge grassroots movement. We've got more than 300,000 parents across the country that are involved, and I volunteer a huge amount of my time. I also go in and give talks to parents about the damage that smartphones and social media do. I've got a talk tomorrow night and one the following night here in London. But I feel like there's more that can be done. And I feel like there's a role for companies and big organizations to be part of this cultural change. So this might be interesting for your audience as well, because whilst I do maintain that there is a role for the state, I'm looking here at kind of civic society. I'm looking at all the other organizations and what role do they have to play. So I'll give you one example, maybe a couple if I may quickly.
Of course.
One example is that I heard from a mom and she said, my child is on the swim team and she goes to these swim meets. And they're quite long because there's all these races. And while she's not in the pool, which is most of the time, all the children are sat there on their phones rather than cheering on their friends or chatting to each other. And isn't there an opportunity here to actually work with the swimming association to say, actually, when the children are together, they should be present. And so how can we encourage them to have a different way of different rules and a different culture? And so I thought, there's really something to this. And so I founded Unplugged Coalition last month to work with organizations to change the culture and to bring out more products and services and spaces where children could be children. They are not burdened by being addicted to a device. And so I want to work with brands that are bringing out hybrid phones that are maybe have GPS tracker, but no internet. So that's sort of new category of phone. I want to work with brands that promote families being outdoors and being active and doing things off their screens. So, and I also want to work with, for instance, the health sector here in Britain, because there's a lot of children who are suffering from speech and language delays or from mental health issues. And a lot of times doctors and clinicians don't always appreciate that part of what's driving those children's problems is their smartphone use. And so we need to have conversations with families about how they can reduce that and improve the health of their child. So I think we can work with brands, with companies, with sporting associations, volunteer groups, with the health sector, a huge range, and with schools, because as you noted, there's a huge amount of schools that are moving away from allowing smartphones in classrooms and on their premises. And so I also want to encourage schools to go further quicker. So it's really an organization that seeks to unite other organizations to promote childhood without addictive technology. And so, looking for partners here in the UK and looking to really accelerate that move to a smartphone-free childhood.
Sounds good. I do think on a civil society level, definitely work on this. Sounds very fruitful. What can people do? Where can they reach out to you if they want to learn more about what you do and maybe collaborate?
Yeah, well, they can contact me. I'm at Jennifer at unpluggedcoalition.com, or you can search online for my very, very small embryonic website, which will hopefully have more content as the days and weeks progress. But yeah, I mean, really, I think it's for people to think about what they can do in their own lives, right? I mean, you've brought this topic onto your podcast to start the conversation or continue the conversation with your audience. I think in our own lives, we can all think about, talking about within our own families, talking about this within our own communities or class groups at our children's schools, or maybe if we run a company or we run a space, how do we make that space smartphone free or tech free so that kids can be kids? So I think it's really up to everyone to kind of think about what positive difference they can make, because at the end of the day, what could be better than happier, healthier kids?
That sounds like a very positive note. I really appreciate that you took the time to come on to have this discussion. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Really good to be on, Daniel. Hope to speak to you again.
Yes, for sure. And of course, I also want to thank all our listeners and readers at New Rechts. If you want to support this kind of conversations, then please consider subscribing at nieuwrechts.nl or on the social media channels. And I'll see you in the next one.